Hey guys, in this video I want to show you how to increase the readability and extensibility of your unit tests. I created a cancel order service which is part of a web shop. It's a pretty simple class that has a single public method named cancel async. The method takes an input model, and the first test that we want to perform is check if the input model is null, and if it is, we want to throw an argument null exception. We then retrieve an order through the order repository, which is injected inside the constructor, and we then want to assert if the order can be cancelled. This consists of 3 steps. First, we check if the order is null, and if it is, we will throw an order not found exception. We will then check if the user ID of the input model is different than the buyer ID of the order. If that is the case, the user is not the owner of the order, and therefore we will throw an unauthorized operation exception. And lastly, we will check if the status of the order is different than processing, and if it is, we will throw an invalid order operation exception, because orders can only be cancelled if the order status is processing. If all the assertions are okay, we will set the order status to cancelled and then call the order repository to update the order. I already created unit tests for these scenarios, and if we look at those tests, I see both some good parts and some bad parts. The one thing that I like is the naming convention. Here we have the subject under test, then we have an underscore which is followed by the test scenario. In this case, if the input model is null, again we see an underscore, and finally we see the expected behavior, and that is that an argument null exception gets thrown. So that is looking good. Also, if we look at the act and the assertion part, this is just fine. The same goes for this test method. Here we have the assertion and the act, and here we assert if the message is as expected, which is also fine. So those are the good parts of the unit tests, but there are also some parts that I'm not a big fan of. First, if we look at the creation of the order input, of the cancel order input model, we see that it is called here. Well, I should actually highlight this as well, because this is part of it as well. So that is 6 lines of code here again, but here we also provide a user ID. So that is 7 lines of code, all duplicates. Same goes for this method, this method. So that is a part that we can improve on. Another part that I'm not a big fan of is that we see the technical implementation of the mocking framework. It makes it harder to read, and it also, as you can see, it also gets duplicated in all of the test methods. So again, we have duplicate code, and it decreases the readability of the test. Another disadvantage of this is that it will be harder for us to switch to another mocking framework. Obviously, it's not something that you do every day, but if for some reason you would want to switch to another mocking framework, it would be more easy if this would be extracted to a method. Now I simply want to get started with refactoring the unit tests to show you how we can make it more readable. So let's start with this method, and this method is actually quite fine. It's also a very simple test. Here we create a cancel order input model, which we assign the value null to, and we then check if an argument null exception gets thrown for the name input model. That is fine. I will not touch that test method for now. But now if we look at this method, like I said before, I want to move the creation of the input model to a separate method. So let's start with that. Let me copy this and then create a new method. I will make this a private static method, which will return a cancel order input model. I will name the method simply create input model. It will not take any parameters. And here we will simply return new. And now we need to define order ID and user ID. They do not have to be variables, so I will simply create constants for them at the top of the class. So here private const long, and then for order ID I will assign the value 1, and for user ID I will assign the value 2. I believe that's the way, yeah, that we also did it within our tests. So now this method is fine. We simply want to use it within our tests. We don't need it here because we assign null, but here we do want to use it. So var input model is create input model. And now if we compare this to this part, it's much more compact and it's also very easy to read. So let's replace it here as well. And here, and also in the happy flow. There we go. And after every refactor step, I will run the tests again to see if everything is still working. So let's run our tests. And they still pass. Very good. Okay, the next thing I want to address is the creation of the order. Over here it's fine because it's null. But if we look, this is actually a very specific case, but let's take a look at the creation of this order. We see that a new order gets created and we set the buyer ID to 3. If you are not aware of the context of this test, this will not mean anything to you. What it actually does, and you can know that if you read this part of the name of the test, user ID not matching order buyer ID, then an unauthorized operation exception gets thrown. So then I know that ID 3 is equal, or I should better say is not equal to the user ID of the input model. Instead of doing it like this, let's create a new method again. And let's name this, let's see, it will again be a private static method, but this time it will return an order. And I will name this create order belonging to another buyer. And we'll return this. Let's copy the name of the method. And now instead of this, let's say var order is much more readable. This is, as soon as someone reads this, especially let's imagine that a new employee joins your team and takes a first look at the code, he will instantly understand what happens at this line. So that's another good improvement. Now, if we look at the creation of the other orders within our tests, we see here that an order gets created. Here it uses the user ID, and here as well. We see that in this scenario, it takes an order status of cancelled or delivered, and here it takes the status processing. So the status should be variable. So now that we know that, we can create another method, and I will name this one create own order. And like I said, the status is a variable, so I will create a parameter for that. So order status. And then we return a new order. That is fine like this. Let's copy the name of the method again. And now if we go back to this method, we can simply say for order is, and we want to provide the status. And we will do the same for this test, but now instead of the status variable, we will provide the processing status. So that is order status dot processing. And now we know that we create an order that belongs to the user that performs the request, and the status we can provide. So that's also looking a lot better. And now for the implementation details of the mocking framework. Like I said, I also want to extract those. But instead of creating a method within this class, I want to use the builder pattern. And I will show you how that works. Let's start with the creation of a folder for our builder. The convention that I use, and I must say that it's not a common convention, but it's one that I and my colleagues use and that I enjoy a lot. It's starting with an underscore as prefix and then builders. And what the underscore says to us is that it does not contain test classes, but it contains helpers. So in this case, it will contain builders, but if we would need other helpers that do not actually contain tests, we will also name the folder, start the name of the folder with an underscore. I use the same folder structure as for the test, so I will copy those so I do not have to create them manually again. And now we want to create a builder for our cancel order service. So I will name this cancel order service builder. And I will make this an internal class because I only want it to be used within this project. And inside the constructor, I want to do the same thing that I did in the constructor of the test itself. So I will copy this part. And I did not highlight this yet when we walked through the test, but I use AutoMocker for the creation of my mocks and for the creation of the service. I provide mock behavior strict because I want an exception to be thrown if a mock is called that we did not create a setup for. And the mocking framework that I use is mocku. So now let's add the missing usings and create fields for the repository and the service. There we go. Now let's create a method to actually build the service, and this will do nothing more than returning the service field. And now if we go back to the test and look at the implementation of the mocking framework that we wanted to replace, we see what happens here is that if an ID is provided, well, let's state it like this. A setup is created to retrieve an order by ID and an order gets returned. For this test scenario, the order will be null. So we want to create a setup for the scenario that no order is found for an ID. So let's create a method for that. And because I want to use a fluent style for the creation of the builder, I will return a cancel order service builder. And let's name this method without order for ID. And obviously we will need an ID, so. And then if we go back to the test, we can copy this part, move it over here, and we can also copy this part, because for this method we want to return null. And then in order to return an instance of cancel order service builder, we will return this. So now we have the methods to create a mock for, well, not create a mock, create a setup for the order repository mock, and for the method getById async, and it will return an order that is null. Let's now, before we start with the use of, well, actually, let's just start with it right away. So let's say we want to create an instance of the service, and we will, to keep it consistent, we will start with it in this method. So we will create a service using the cancel order service builder. And in this scenario, we don't need any setup, so we can simply build it and replace this with the service that we created through the builder. Let's run this test and see if it still works. Not really sure if it ran. It's still green, but let's run it one more time to be sure. And it's green indeed, so it's still working. And now for this method, let's create a builder again. New cancel order service builder. This time we want to create a setup for the scenario that no order exists for the provided ID. We can then remove this part. And here again, we will use the service that is created through the builder. Now let's run this test method. And it passes as well. Now in this scenario, we do want to return an order. So we will have to create a new method within our builder. I will copy this. And I will name this with order for ID. And because we want to make this, we want to allow the caller of this method to provide the order itself in order to support a lot of scenarios. So we will create another parameter for the order. We can then remove this, and this will now work. One thing we could also have done, instead of creating this method, we could have simply created this method and then provide null for the order. But again, to improve readability, I prefer creating this method over using this method and providing null, but both cases are valid in my opinion. I will now copy this as well to not have to type it all the time. So we will again create a service, but this time with an order for the provided ID. And we will provide the order that we created here, so the order belonging to another buyer. Again, we will use the service created through the builder. And now let's run this test. And it still passes. We can do the same for this method. The setup is the same here, only the creation of the order is different. We again replace the service and run this test. It passes again. And now for the happy flow, we will replace this again. But then we see that for the happy flow, we need to create a setup for another method of the order repository, and that is the update method. So again, we will go to the builder and we will create a method that we will name. Let's start with the return type, that is cancel order service builder, and we will name the method update order. It will take an order as input parameter, and we will then copy this, and another option for this would be to remove the input parameter and specify here it is any order. But I do not prefer this method because we want to be sure that the order that is provided within the update async method of the repository matches the one that is provided as parameter. So we remove this and put this back in place again, and then simply return this. And now we can call the newly created method as well. So update order, we will provide the order, and then we can remove this part as well. We want to use the service that we created through the builder. And now if we run this test, let's see if it passes as well. We see that it does. So now the only thing remaining is doing a bit of cleanup within this test, because there are a couple of things that can now be removed. This constructor is no longer necessary, and the same goes for the mock and the service because they are created through the builder. So let's remove this. I also see we have some usings that are no longer necessary. I will remove those as well. And now if we look at the test, and let's take a look at the test methods themselves. So if we look at this, and let's compare it, what I will do is I will add another test class, and that will contain the content of the test before we did our refactoring. Cancel order service tests old, and I still have that here in my notepad. And if I paste that here, yeah, it complains over the fact that we have a duplicate test class and duplicate test methods, but that's not of importance for me for now. I simply want to compare the two to show you the difference between the tests and how they are much more readable now. So we have replaced this, which makes it a bit more readable, but it's most relevant within the test methods itself. Like I said, this test method is so brief that it's not really of interest to compare it, but let's take a look at the no order for ID throws order not found exception. If you look at that test and compare it to the old one, we see here that, let's see, it goes from line, let's say 28 to 43, so that's 15 lines. This one goes from 36 to 59, which is 23 lines. But apart from the amount of lines, if we simply read what we see here, we create an input model, we create a cancel order service builder without an order for the ID, and we then check if an order not found exception gets thrown. Very easily readable. Now if we compare that to this, let's see, we create a cancel order input model, we then create an order that is null, then there is an order repository for which we create a setup for the method getById async with the order ID, and it will return the order that was null. See what I mean? I mean, it's not hard to decipher this, but it simply takes more time compared to this. Everything we read here on the left side is readable, and that makes it very easy. The same goes for the second method. Let's look at that as well. Again, if we start on the left side, we create an input model, then we create an order that belongs to another buyer. The cancel order service will return an order for the provided ID, and it will throw an unauthorized operation exception. Okay, now let's take a look at this. We create a cancel order input model, then we create an order with buyer ID 3. The order repository for the getById async method takes an order ID and then returns the order, and it will throw an unauthorized operation exception. It's simply much more complex compared to this part. Simply moving this to another method makes it compact and readable. That goes even more for this method, because reading this exactly states what it does. It creates an order belonging to another buyer, and I mentioned this in the creation of the test as well, but creating an order with a buyer ID 3 means nothing if you don't know the context of the rest of the test, so that's a big improvement as well. I'm not going through the rest of the test because I think I made my point by showing these two test methods. I hope that by watching this video you will be able to create better unit tests. If you have any questions or remarks, make sure to drop them in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like it and to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.